A pair of glasses looks so ordinary now that it is easy to treat it like a small convenience. You smudge the lens, complain for a second, clean it on your shirt, and move on. But in older worlds, blurred sight could quietly change the course of a life. It could shrink your work, your reading, your status, and even your sense of who you were. For someone who carved wood, copied texts, sewed cloth, counted coins, repaired tools, or read sacred words, losing clear vision was not a mild annoyance. It could feel like the world was moving farther away while you were still standing in it. If ordinary objects hiding massive human stories are your thing, subscribe now, because this one changed far more than people realize. The problem was especially cruel because it often arrived slowly. A person might still look healthy, still know their craft, still remember every step of the job, and still have steady hands. But the details would begin to slip. Letters softened. Thread holes vanished. Cracks in wood blurred together. Candlelight often made everything even worse. And since many societies did not fully understand what was happening inside the eye, failing sight was often treated as simple aging, personal weakness, or one more hard truth of life that nobody could fix. That wider human struggle sits behind the history of eyeglasses. Long before glasses became a normal object, poor vision was quietly pushing people out of reading, skilled work, and independence. This mattered most in close work. A farmer with weak distance vision could still survive in many cases, though with real limits. But a scribe, merchant, clerk, jeweler, mapmaker, tailor, or monk depended on fine detail. Once letters and tiny marks became hard to see, experience alone was not enough. Knowledge stayed in the mind, but access to it began to narrow. That is one reason poor vision had a darker side than we usually imagine. It did not just make life inconvenient. It could cut people off from the very tasks that gave them purpose, income, authority, or spiritual standing. The first attempts to fight that blur were clever but limited. People in the ancient world already understood that certain transparent materials could enlarge what sat beneath them. Magnifying lenses and polished crystal objects existed long before wearable glasses. Later, what became known as reading stones gave people a more useful aid for close text. These were usually rounded pieces of glass placed directly on a page, so letters looked larger. They helped some readers, especially older ones struggling with near vision, but they were not yet true eyeglasses. They worked only in certain situations, and they did nothing to solve the larger problem of everyday sight moving with the body through the world. That distinction matters. A reading stone was a tool on a surface. Eyeglasses would become a tool on a person. One enlarged text for a moment. The other let someone carry correction with them. That seems obvious now, but it was a profound leap. It meant vision support could shift from being occasional and awkward to becoming part of ordinary life. Even then, the earliest visual aids mainly helped one specific kind of problem. As many people age, close-up focus becomes harder. Modern readers know this feeling well. A label needs to be held farther away, small writing becomes tiring, and low light turns a simple page into a struggle. Convex lenses, the kind that bulge outward, can help with this by making near objects easier for the eye to focus on. That basic optical truth would eventually reshape reading and work. But for centuries, the knowledge, materials, and craftsmanship needed to turn that principle into something reliable were still developing. There is another part of this story that often gets missed. Poor vision did not strike everyone equally, at least not in its consequences. The burden fell hardest on people whose value depended on precision. Imagine an older copyist in a manuscript room. He knows the text, knows the hand, knows the spacing, knows the discipline of the page. Yet the letters begin to swim. Or think about a woman doing fine sewing in dim indoor light, trying to keep her household income steady while the smallest details fade. What job do you think became hardest the moment someone's eyesight started to fail? That is why the history of vision correction is larger than medicine. It reaches into religion, trade, literacy, and class. In societies where only some people read and write, clear, close vision could help preserve access to knowledge itself. If the few people who handled records, scripture, contracts, and books could not continue that work, the effects traveled outward. By the High Middle Ages, Europe had more reading, more copying, more record-keeping, and more need for sustained close vision than many earlier periods. Reading stones and simple magnifiers showed that sight could be helped, at least partly. The old belief that fading vision was only something to endure had started to crack. People were getting closer to a breakthrough, even if they did not know it yet. The strange part is that once magnification proved useful, the next question almost asked itself. What if that help did not have to stay in your hand or sit on the page? What if a person could actually wear it? That question led to one of the quiet turning points in human history. Somewhere in late 13th century Italy, craftsmen found a way to turn magnifying lenses into something wearable. The earliest eyeglasses were simple, awkward by modern standards, and probably uncomfortable after long use. They did not hook over the ears the way most glasses do now. Early pairs were often balanced on the nose or held in place by hand. But none of that reduced the shock of what they made possible. A person whose near vision was fading no longer had to bring the page closer, search for better light, or give up entirely. For the first time, many people could put help directly in front of their eyes and continue doing work that age had started to take away. That mattered most in a culture where reading and writing were becoming more important. Monks copied religious texts by hand. Merchants, meanwhile, kept meticulous records of their trades. Notaries handled contracts. Officials worked with lists, letters, and accounts. Scholars depended on long hours over manuscripts. In that world, the first eyeglasses were not a fashion accessory and not some little household convenience. They extended usefulness. They protected authority. They gave older readers and writers a way to stay active in jobs where the smallest marks on a page could change meaning, money, or law. The first lenses used in eyeglasses mainly helped people with farsightedness tied to age, what we now call presbyopia. The basic idea is simple. As people get older, the eye becomes less flexible when trying to focus on things close up. That is why older readers so often push a page farther away. Convex lenses, which curve outward, bend light in a way that helps bring nearby text back into focus. The earliest glasses did not solve every vision problem, but they solved one of the most common and most frustrating ones for people who depended on fine, close work. This was especially important because written culture was expanding. Europe in the later Middle Ages was not yet a world of cheap books in every home, but written records mattered more and more. Cities were growing. Trade networks were widening. Religious study carried enormous weight. Universities had appeared. Bureaucracy was growing. A person who could keep reading into older age did not just preserve a private skill. He or she kept a place in a larger system that depended on text. That is one reason eyeglasses changed more than eyesight. They stretched the useful life of trained minds. They allowed people to keep copying, counting, studying, and judging for longer. Think about how much time it takes to become a respected scribe, a careful scholar, or a trusted merchant who can read every mark in a ledger. Without help for fading near vision, much of that value could start slipping away. At the exact moment a person had the most experience. Glasses helped stop that loss. They did not make someone younger, but they delayed one of age's most painful exclusions. At first, though, this new tool was far from universal. Early eyeglasses were handmade and relatively expensive. Good lenses required skill. Frames were primitive. The object itself was fragile. That meant early users were often people with status, education, or money. Scholars, clerics, administrators, merchants, and others whose work justified the cost. In that sense, early glasses were both practical and social. They helped people see, but they also signaled something about the wearer's world. A peasant laborer working outdoors might never own such a thing. A monastery reader or urban professional had a much better chance. That class angle shaped how glasses were understood. They were useful, yes, but they were also tied to learning and authority. In paintings from later centuries, spectacles often appear on scholars, saints, doctors, and readers. That image did not come from nowhere. Glasses had become associated with people whose power came through text, memory, and judgment. They were tools for the face, but they also carried meaning. To wear them could suggest age, seriousness, literacy, and a connection to written knowledge. There is something almost moving about that first generation of users. Many of them had likely assumed their reading life would narrow with age. Then suddenly a lens stood between them and that loss. A page that had gone soft sharpened again. A line of script returned. A margin note could be read. Work resumed. Imagine the relief of that moment. Not perfect vision, not a miracle. Just the return of access. And yet the breakthrough had clear limits. These early glasses mainly helped people who struggled to see things up close. They were far less useful for someone whose main problem was distance blur. A person who could not clearly see across a room, read signs from afar, or judge distant movement was still living with a different kind of difficulty. So even as eyeglasses began to change reading and close work, millions of others remained in a world where sight could still quietly close doors. That should have made glasses an obvious answer to human vision problems. But for a long time, they were only a partial answer, and the rest of that story took much longer to unfold. Even after eyeglasses appeared in medieval Italy, blurry vision did not suddenly become a solved problem. The first major breakthrough mainly helped people who struggled with near work as they aged. That was life-changing for readers, scribes, and merchants, but it left a huge part of the population with the same old problem: distance blur. A person could still lose track of faces across a room, fail to judge movement at a distance, struggle with outdoor work, or simply live in a world that never came fully into focus. Eyeglasses had opened a door, but at first they only opened part of it. The science behind that difference is simple once you strip the jargon away. A convex lens, the kind used in the earliest glasses, bulges outward and helps some people bring close objects back into focus. A concave lens curves inward and helps correct myopia or nearsightedness, which makes distant objects look blurry. Britannica notes that the earliest glasses had convex lenses, while a concave lens for myopia is first clearly evident in Raphael's 1517 portrait of Pope Leo VI. That tells us something important. Wearable vision correction existed for centuries before one of the most common forms of blurry sight was clearly represented in the historical record. That long gap helps explain why the story of glasses is not a neat invention tale where one good idea instantly fixes everything. It was slow, it was uneven. It depended on trial and error, better glassmaking, better grinding, and a deeper understanding of how light behaves. Medieval and early modern lens makers were doing delicate work by hand. A useful lens had to be shaped with enough precision to help rather than distort. And even when the principle was known, making reliable lenses at scale was another challenge entirely. Venice and Murano became major centers of glassmaking in the later medieval and Renaissance periods, which mattered because improvements in glass craftsmanship supported the wider culture of lenses and optical tools. The darker side of poor vision stayed with people all through that slow transition. Imagine being skilled enough to do a job, but no longer able to see it properly. An older craft worker might still know every movement, but miss the fine details that made the work saleable. A clerk might confuse marks in a ledger. A navigator or lookout with poor distance vision might misread what was happening far away. A child with uncorrected vision could be seen as lazy, slow, or inattentive, when the real problem was that the world on the board or page never looked sharp in the first place. Those consequences are partly an inference from what historians and eye specialists know about how uncorrected refractive errors affect reading and distance focus, but the logic is strong. Once a society depends on fine detail, uncorrected sight becomes a social and economic problem, not just a personal one. There was also the matter of stigma. Glasses could signal learning, but they could also signal age. They might suggest authority in one setting and weakness in another. Portraits from later centuries often show glasses on scholars, churchmen, and readers, which reinforced their link to literacy and serious work. But that same association could make them feel unusual, elite, or even slightly suspect outside those circles. A person wearing spectacles was visibly marked. That mark could mean intelligence. It could also mean decline. For someone already worried about aging, that was no small thing. Access stayed uneven too. Good lenses cost money. Frames cost money. Eye care knowledge was limited, so the people most likely to benefit were still those who could afford the object or whose work made the expense worth it. That meant glasses often followed the same paths as literacy, trade, and urban wealth. The people handling documents, books, accounts, and skilled close work had the strongest reason to seek correction. Millions of others either went without or used imperfect, temporary, or second-hand solutions. In that sense, the history of glasses is also a history of inequality. Better sight existed, but not everyone could reach it. What makes this period so interesting is that eyeglasses were already proving something larger than their inventors could have measured. They were showing that human limitation did not always have to be accepted as fixed fate. A person could alter the way the world entered the eye. That sounds obvious now because modern life is full of corrective technologies. But for people living through the spread of lenses, it was a profound idea. It meant aging did not have to erase reading at the exact moment someone had gained wisdom. It meant poor sight was not just a punishment to endure, it might be managed. By the early modern period, better optics and broader knowledge gradually widened what glasses could do. The science of vision became clearer, lens craftsmanship improved, and more forms of correction became possible. But the transformation still moved unevenly across class, region, and occupation. Some people gained years of working life and intellectual independence. Others remained trapped in blur simply because the right lens never reached them. Would people around you have respected glasses or treated them as a sign that something was wrong with you? That question matters because spectacles were never just about sight. They changed who could keep reading, who could keep earning, and who could keep functioning without constant help. Once lens making improved further and glasses became easier to produce and buy, that quiet advantage stopped belonging only to scholars and urban professionals. It began spreading outward into the wider public. And that is when glasses stopped being a specialized aid for the few and started becoming one of the great unnoticed tools of ordinary life. Once glasses became easier to make, easier to fit, and easier to buy, their role changed completely. They were no longer only a specialist tool for aging readers in monasteries, scholars in manuscript rooms, or wealthy merchants bent over account books. They started spreading into the wider world of ordinary work. That shift matters because the true power of eyeglasses was never just sharper sight. It was the way sharper sight let people stay useful, stay independent, and stay connected to a society that was asking more and more from the human eye. By the modern era, that demand had become enormous. Printed books were everywhere, schools expanded. Governments ran on forms, files, and records. Factories needed precision, shops needed bookkeeping. Medicine depended on close observation, science depended on tiny distinctions. Modern life did not just reward clear vision, it quietly assumed it. In that environment, mass-produced glasses became one of the most important unseen supports of everyday civilization. They helped children read, workers continue skilled labor, clerks process information, and older adults keep doing tasks that would otherwise slip out of reach. That wider transformation depended on industry, better lens grinding, better optical knowledge, cheaper materials, and more efficient manufacturing made correction less rare than it had been for centuries. Britannica notes that eyeglasses eventually became ordinary corrective tools for myopia, hyperopia, and astigmatism, not just aging readers using simple magnifiers. What began as a narrow aid for a limited group turned into a broad system for helping millions function in work, education, and daily life. The social effect of that is larger than it first appears. Glasses did not simply help one person read one page. They extended those productive years for everyone. They let experienced workers keep contributing instead of being pushed aside by fading near vision. They helped preserve literacy in aging populations. They made it easier for children and adults to participate in school and written culture. They also made many forms of precision labor more realistic on a mass scale. A tailor, watch repairer, clerk, teacher, pharmacist, printer, machinist, or office worker all benefited from the same basic promise. Your eyes do not have to decide on their own whether you still get to take part. That is why eyeglasses belong in the history of knowledge just as much as in the history of medicine. A society can train people for years, fill shelves with books, create systems of law and record, and build institutions around written information. But if large numbers of people cannot clearly see what they are meant to read, copy, inspect, or judge, all of that becomes harder to sustain. Glasses helped close that gap. They were a tiny technology with a giant consequence. They allowed more people to stay inside the world of detail. They also changed aging in a very human way. Growing older had always carried the threat of visual loss, especially for near work. Spectacles did not erase aging, but they softened one of its social blows. A person who had spent decades building knowledge no longer had to watch access to text fade at the exact moment experience was deepest. In that sense, glasses gave something more than clarity. They gave time back. Even now, the story is not finished. The World Health Organization says at least 2.2 billion people globally have a vision impairment or blindness, and at least 1 billion cases could have been prevented or have yet to be addressed. Ju also states that uncorrected refractive error remains the leading cause of vision impairment in both children and adults, with consequences that include poorer school performance, reduced workforce participation, and social isolation in older adults. That means one of the oldest problems in this story is still with us. The lens may exist, but access does not always follow. That modern reality gives the whole history extra weight. We often treat glasses as boring, cheap, or slightly annoying. Some people swap them for contact lenses, others move to surgery, some wear frames as fashion. But underneath all of that is the same basic truth that made the first spectacles so important centuries ago. A corrected line of sight can protect education, work, independence, and dignity. The object looks small because we are used to it. Its consequences were never small. So yes, eyeglasses changed reading. They changed work. They changed what aging looked like. They changed who could stay in the world of books, records, precision, and skilled labor. They even changed the meaning of poor vision itself. What had once been accepted as fate became, at least for many people, something that could be corrected. And that may be the most remarkable part of all. A pair of glasses weighs almost nothing in the hand, yet it helped millions hold on to their place in the world. If this changed the way you look at something as ordinary as a pair of glasses, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me what everyday object you want me to trace next.